The CEO had never been so cruel to a man who was standing there with grease on his hands and a child's drawing folded inside his jacket. She had called him a nobody, mocked his worn-out clothes, and told him that men like him were always looking for handouts. But before the day was over, she would discover something that would shatter every judgment she had ever made about him. For nearly 3 years, that nobody had been quietly donating blood again and again to keep her dying father alive. If you believe kindness can exist where nobody expects it, that forgiveness can heal what pride destroys, and that second chances can change a life, please take a moment to like, comment, share this story with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to our channel so our family can continue bringing you stories that remind us what truly matters. The man's name was Callum Reeves, a 36-year-old single father who repaired damaged vehicles at a small independent garage on the edge of the city. He was not wealthy, famous, or particularly confident. His hands were rough from years of mechanical work, his boots were permanently stained with oil, and his old blue jacket had been repaired so many times that even Callum had stopped counting the patches. But every morning he arrived before the garage opened because his 9-year-old daughter, Elsie, depended entirely on him. Her mother had left their lives several years earlier, and Callum had never allowed himself to become bitter about it. He worked during the day, packed Elsie's lunches, helped with her school projects, fixed her broken toys, and saved every spare dollar for the small dream they shared of someday moving into a brighter home with a garden. He never complained about being tired because whenever Elsie looked at him with those trusting eyes, he remembered why he kept going. That morning, Callum had been asked to inspect a luxury sedan belonging to the powerful Vale Automotive Group. The company was controlled by Vivian Mercer, a brilliant 42-year-old CEO known throughout the city for turning struggling businesses into multi-million-dollar successes. Vivian was admired for her intelligence but feared for her coldness. She believed emotions created weakness, and weakness created failure. Her father, Conrad Mercer, had founded the company decades earlier, but now he was gravely ill with a rare blood disorder that required regular transfusions. Vivian had spent months paying for specialists, experimental treatments, and private medical care, yet nothing seemed enough. She had become obsessed with saving her father because, beneath all her power and confidence, she was still the frightened daughter of a man who had once carried her on his shoulders through the factory where she grew up. Callum had been brought in because one of Vivian's racing vehicles had suffered severe mechanical damage during testing. The engineers had already inspected it, but the problem remained hidden somewhere deep inside the engine system. Callum recognized the issue within minutes. He had an unusual talent for understanding machines by listening to them, almost as if engines spoke a language only he could hear. He carefully explained what needed to be replaced and showed the damaged component to the company's engineering team. But Vivian entered the workshop just as Callum was finishing, and the sight of him immediately irritated her. She looked at his battered jacket, his old work boots, and the faded backpack resting beside him, then glanced at the expensive facility around them. In her mind, he did not belong there. She questioned his qualifications, and when Callum calmly explained that he had spent 15 years repairing high-performance vehicles, Vivian dismissed his experience as insignificant compared with the university-trained engineers working for her company. When he mentioned that he could complete the repair faster and for less money, she laughed in front of several employees. She accused him of trying to impress her with cheap labor and suggested that a single father struggling to pay his bills probably had no business advising a CEO about million-dollar cars. Callum stood silently as the words landed. He could have defended himself. He could have told her that the old car parked outside was the only vehicle he owned, that he had sold almost everything valuable after his divorce, or that he sometimes skipped meals so Elsie could have enough school supplies. Instead, he simply lowered his eyes and finished explaining the repair. One of Vivian's senior engineers later admitted that Callum was right. The vehicle was repaired exactly according to his instructions, and the engine performed better than it had before the accident. Vivian was forced to acknowledge his technical ability, but she did not apologize. She simply handed him a modest payment and told him that people like him should be grateful when successful companies gave them an opportunity. Callum accepted the envelope without arguing. He had learned long ago that dignity did not require winning every argument. Sometimes dignity meant walking away without becoming the person who had hurt you. But as Callum turned toward the exit, Vivian noticed a small hospital card sticking out of his wallet. She asked about it, and he hesitated before explaining that he donated blood regularly at a local medical center. His daughter had once asked him why he kept doing it when he was already exhausted, and he had told her that if someone was fighting to stay alive, a little discomfort from him was a small price to pay. Vivian barely listened. She assumed he was trying to make himself look noble after their unpleasant encounter. She turned away, and Callum left. What Vivian did not know was that Callum had been donating a rare blood type for years. 3 years earlier, when Conrad Mercer had suffered a sudden medical crisis, the hospital had struggled to find enough compatible donors. Callum happened to be registered with a rare donor program, and after learning that a patient desperately needed his blood, he volunteered. He never asked who the patient was. He never asked for money. He simply gave what he could. Then he returned again whenever the hospital contacted him. Over time, he became one of the most reliable donors connected to Conrad's treatment. The hospital records listed his name, but Vivian had never seen them because she had been too busy managing specialists, lawyers, and executives to notice the ordinary people quietly helping her father survive. Several weeks passed, and Conrad's condition suddenly worsened. His doctors warned Vivian that he needed another transfusion urgently. The hospital contacted its donor network, and Callum received the request while he was repairing a delivery van. He immediately left work, arranged for a neighbor to collect Elsie from school, and went to the hospital. He donated blood that afternoon, feeling weak afterward but refusing to complain. He sat in the recovery area drinking juice while looking at a picture Elsie had drawn for him. It showed a little girl holding her father's hand beneath a bright yellow sun. Underneath, she had written, "My dad fixes everything." At that exact time, Vivian arrived at the hospital carrying documents for her father's doctors. She saw Callum sitting there and recognized him instantly. For a moment, irritation crossed her face. She wondered why he was there, then noticed the donor bracelet around his wrist. Before she could ask, one of Conrad's physicians approached her with an expression of relief. He explained that the compatible donor had arrived again and that the transfusion could proceed. Vivian asked for the donor's name because she wanted to thank him personally. The doctor looked at the paperwork and quietly said, "Callum Reeves." The world seemed to stop. Vivian stared at the name as if she had never seen it before. She asked how long Callum had been donating. The doctor explained that he had been one of Conrad's recurring donors for almost 3 years. Vivian could barely process the information. The man she had mocked that morning had given blood to her father repeatedly. The man she had accused of being desperate for money had never asked her family for a single dollar. The man she had looked down on because of his clothes had literally given part of himself to keep her father alive. Vivian rushed toward the donor area, but Callum was already preparing to leave. She stopped him and finally asked whether he knew who the patient was. Callum admitted that he had known only the patient's first name from some of the hospital paperwork and had never cared to learn anything more. When Vivian told him that Conrad was her father, Callum looked genuinely surprised. He remembered the elderly patient he had unknowingly helped over the years, but he had never imagined that the family connected to him belonged to the company whose CEO had humiliated him. Vivian's pride collapsed in an instant. She apologized, but Callum did not immediately accept it. Not because he wanted revenge, but because her words had reminded him of every time people had judged him for being poor, for raising a daughter alone, for wearing old clothes, and for refusing to pretend that his life was easier than it was. He told her that the cruelest thing she had done was not insulting his work. It was making him feel ashamed of a life he was actually proud of. He had never been rich, but he had raised Elsie with honesty. He had never owned expensive things, but he had given his time, his strength, and even his blood to strangers. Vivian began to cry. She confessed that fear had made her cruel. Her father was the last person who still remembered the little girl she had once been, before ambition hardened her. She had spent years believing that money could protect the people she loved, and when it failed, she became angry at everyone around her. She admitted that she had forgotten how to recognize goodness unless it came wearing an expensive suit. Callum looked at her for a long moment and told her that fear did not excuse cruelty, but admitting it was the first step toward becoming different. Then he did something Vivian never expected. He forgave her. Conrad eventually stabilized, and his doctors credited the continued availability of compatible blood as an important part of his treatment. When he learned what had happened, he insisted on meeting Callum. The elderly businessman was humbled when he discovered that the man who had helped save his life was not an executive, investor, or celebrity, but a struggling mechanic and devoted father. Conrad thanked him with tears in his eyes, but Callum told him that gratitude was enough. Still, Vivian refused to let the lesson end there. She changed the company's policy toward contract workers, introduced fairer payment practices, and created a donor support program for employees and members of the local community. She also offered Callum a position overseeing specialized vehicle restoration, but she made it clear that he could refuse without consequence. Callum accepted only after ensuring that the position would allow him to keep his garage work and spend time with Elsie. Vivian agreed without hesitation. Months later, Callum stood inside the company's restored workshop while Elsie proudly watched him demonstrate an engine he had rebuilt. Vivian stood nearby with her father, who was healthier and walking with a cane. The old CEO looked at Elsie's drawing on Callum's workbench and smiled. The picture was almost identical to the one Callum had carried that day at the hospital. A father and daughter beneath a bright sun, holding hands. Vivian finally understood the meaning of the picture. Callum had spent his entire life believing that fixing things was what he did. Engines, broken toys, old cars, damaged machines. But sometimes the most important things he fixed were invisible. He had helped repair the hope inside a dying family without even knowing their name. And in return, that family had helped repair something inside him too, the belief that kindness could still be seen, even by people who had forgotten how to look for it. Before the story ends, take a moment and leave a meaningful comment telling us what you would have done if you were Callum. Would you have forgiven someone who humiliated you after discovering that you had unknowingly saved the life of someone they loved? Your answer might remind someone else that forgiveness is not weakness, sometimes it is the strongest thing a person can give. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Because sometimes the person we look down on is carrying the very gift that keeps us alive, and sometimes the greatest heroes are not the ones standing beneath bright lights, but the ones quietly giving what they have while asking for nothing in return. Callum never donated blood to become important. He did it because someone needed help. And perhaps that is the purest definition of kindness, giving a piece of yourself to save someone else, even when you may never know their name.